Hello to, okay. Okay, I just had to authorize them to videotape me. To everyone in the room, to everyone on Zoom, it's wonderful to once again commemorate Kristallnacht with a Kristallnacht Commemoration lecture by Professor Oren Stier, our Professor Oren Stier. Kristallnacht commemorates the night of broken glass, the night, the pogrom during which 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed, 30,000 Jewish men were incarcerated, sent to work in concentration camps, and 267 synagogues were destroyed in Germany and Austria. And it's been our commitment to commemorate, in addition to Yom HaShoah, which the entire Yom HaShoah planning committee is in attendance tonight, in addition to commemorating in a very formalized way every year Yom HaShoah, we're committed to Kristallnacht as well, especially because of its focus as an assault on the synagogue. As a synagogue, as a center of Jewish life, understanding that destroying synagogues is destroying the fabric of what binds us together and keeps us strong. And so it's appropriate that we're still early on in the in-person programming as the pandemic wanes and continues hopefully to get better. But it's great that we're here. It's great that we're here and we're commemorating at a very vibrant, dynamic shul community, part of which is commemorating the Holocaust, and Kristallnacht is part of that. So thank you for participating, and I want to thank Professor Stier, Oren, who always agrees to participate in this. And one of the things I missed so much about during COVID was that I didn't have the chance to grab Oren on his way out Friday night and ask him, what's going on with the Florida Holocaust curriculum? What's going on with the Life magazine insert about Anne Frank? All my Holocaust questions went unanswered for a long period of time, but I'm very happy that we'll have the opportunity to continue to talk about it because of what it means to me and because of what it allows us to continue to honor the memory of this important seminal event in Jewish history. So we look forward to your words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I really appreciate having this opportunity every year to speak. I'm very grateful to the Holocaust Education Planning Committee at Young Israel for asking me every year. I think this is my 11th year doing this. It always, every time you ask, I start by thinking, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. And then it always ends up that I have too much to say. But I'm grateful for the opportunity. This particular talk is coming out of a couple of different places. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So that we can begin. Great. So thank you again for the opportunity. I began thinking about this year's talk around 9/11, the 20th anniversary milestone coupled with Shabbat Shuvah. Lost my video. Am I back? Oh, yeah.
Maybe it doesn't when you automatically.
Yeah, when I share. Okay. Is it back?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just like that.
Well, no. Full screen. To do it again?
No, still not yet.
Okay, good. Okay, take two. So 9/11 anniversary, the 20th anniversary, coupled with Shabbat Shuvah, its proximity to Rosh Hashanah, the other Yom HaZikaron, and how that memory already seems to be fading. And I started thinking about what do we do? What are we doing as a society to make that memory more active and relevant to a generation growing up with no memory of the Twin Towers? I'm starting to have students now who their entire lives, They don't know about a World Trade Center. And it got me thinking about what is at stake in any kind of memorial activity, why commemoration even matters, and so hence my title. I'm reminded of Elie Wiesel's Nobel Prize lecture, not the speech she gave, but the formal lecture that he gave associated with the speech, in which he wrote, and I quote, "Remembering is a noble and necessary act. The call to memory, the call reaches us from the very dawn of history. No commandment figures so frequently, so insistently in the Bible. It's incumbent upon us to remember the good we've received and the evil we've suffered. New Year's Day, Rosh Hashanah, is also called Yom HaZikaron, the day of memory. On that day, the day of universal judgment, man appeals to God to remember. Our salvation depends on it. If God wishes to remember our suffering, all will be well. If he refuses, all will be lost. Thus, the rejection of memory becomes a divine curse, one that would doom us to repeat past disasters, past wars. If something is at stake, it means it's at risk of loss or damage. When we identify the stakes of something, we're saying those are the things that may be gained or may be lost, that there are consequences for, in this case, how we remember the Holocaust. The biggest consequence, I would say, is collective amnesia, social forgetfulness. What is commemoration? The Oxford English Dictionary provides a definition, quote, a calling to remembrance or preserving in memory by some solemn observance, public celebration, etc. Solemnization of the memory of anything, from the Latin commemorare, I never took Latin, to bring to remembrance, to make mention of. I choose this term deliberately because it connotes a kind of public activity, performance, and because it holds within it the prefix commemorate, indicating something done with or together with someone else. And I'm going to return to this. I also need to tell you that I'm working with a very broad notion of commemoration, somewhat idiosyncratic. I want to include a lot of examples of memorials, monuments, acts of remembrance. This definition, this idea, encompasses memorials that are both permanent and ephemeral, small and large scale, even challenges to and attacks on memory itself. Now, this is tricky because this clip is age restricted. It's amazing what is age restricted and what isn't. We'll see what happens when I try to go and then come back. That, of course, is Charlottesville. And the reason I'm including this is because I increasingly see Holocaust memory as some high-stakes competition for attention, for resources, over the very meaning of the past for people in the present. And that happens to anyone. I'm interested specifically in commemoration as a stepping off point because the term accentuates its best examples, the complex intersections of temporality and geography. Commemoration connotes an event at a time and in a place that are, if not sacred, then certainly infused with a kind of symbolic meaning. The place is often, though not always, the site of the event being commemorated. And the time is often the anniversary of that event. Of course, we also have special days on the calendar set aside for commemoration that have grown to encompass and accommodate much more than what their original anniversaries indicate. like November 9th or January 27th, or the special compromise case of the 27th of Nisan, all of which I've spoken about previously. I think that was year 3 or so. A good example of the effective intersection of time and space is the March of the Living. Let me try this one. Yeah. And just kind of take a look at what's going on there because it's going to come up later. I hope you can see. But often the special dates on the calendar have themselves become unmoored from any geographical locations to which they were once tethered, or conversely, memorial ceremonies take place at the sites where the original events occurred, but at unremarked times. And what's interesting about the March is that it kind of gets both of those pretty well. Or it may even be the case that effective commemoration occurs at a site that marks neither the place nor the time of original events, as for example, at Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, considering all of the activities of veterans and family members who visit at all hours, light candles, make rubbings of the names, and generally interact with the site. Why are such memorial activities so successful? So I'm looking at an eclectic range of examples. One thing I will say is that while monuments and memorials need not be temporally or spatially commemorative, when they are so, they're especially powerful. They access a special kind of power and resonance. And in those cases, they attract my interest. We're going to look at a few of these later this evening. Therefore, altogether, what I'm looking at is what I want to call memorial activism, somewhere at the intersection of politics, theater, media, history, and society. What links these disparate types of memorial intervention together under a broad conceptualization of commemoration is performativity, the ways they enact memory. Commemoration ceremonies are certainly public performances, whether they take place at monuments and memorials or not. But even some memorials and monuments themselves, even on their off days, can exude a powerful performativity. Look at this photo, for example. I want to examine the issues surrounding Holocaust memorialization and commemoration as performance by looking at a range of examples, asking how they enact memory and what we might learn from these enactments. So there's a whole basket of issues, and if I did all of this, it would be like a 2-hour talk. So the things I'm not going to get to are the use of virtual reality, the wearing of badges. I'm going to touch a little bit on some Nazi imagery, which I already did once, and I'm going to come back to at the end. But I'm really going to focus on just 2 kinds of examples. One is an implicit drama in Holocaust memorials, and the other is the issue of self-representation. Most of my examples are contemporary, but before we get to the recent examples, I want to take the time to address some early cases. And I have a reason for doing this, because I want to challenge the notion that commemoration is largely passive and that it only happens after historical events have run their course, that it's only retrospective. I want to propose that it is in linking the commemorative impulse to real present-day ongoing instances of anti-Semitism, for example, that commemoration of the past might find renewed vigor and relevance. And I wish there were some younger people here, but maybe they're online. Okay, so possibly the earliest known commemorative gathering against Nazism and its assault on European Jewry occurred on the eve of Tisha B'Av, July 21st, 1942, when the American Jewish Congress, B'nai B'rith, the Jewish Labor Committee, the American Jewish Committee organized a mass protest at Madison Square Garden. At the time, the New York Times reported 20,000 people crowded inside, with many more thousands outside protesting Nazi atrocities. I'm going to tell you the date again, July 21st, 1942. They expressed their grief and indignation and called for American and United Nations action on behalf of European Jewry. There's a long list of speakers. I'm not going to get into it. If you want, you can come up really close and look at, this is the Jewish Telegraphic Agency's original article from that day, reporting on things like President Roosevelt sending a message of sorrow and a promise to hold the Nazis to strict accountability for their crimes on an inevitable day of reckoning. It took him another couple of years, but he sort of got there. This protest was held in response to the first reports in June 1942 of mass gassing at Chelmno, reported by Shmuel Zeigelboim, a Jewish member of the Polish National Council in exile, a former member of the Warsaw Judenrat prior to the construction of the ghetto. And his report was widely covered in the Jewish press, not the non-Jewish press. By November and December of that year, public acts of protest, fasting, prayer, mourning, work stoppages, minutes of radio and school silence, school closures, and more were being held worldwide, often with non-Jewish groups joining in or holding their own observances. Now, to give you a sense of what these public acts of protest were up against, I want to call our attention to another case in which Madison Square Garden was used as a stage. Some 2.5 years earlier, on February 20th, 1939, when American Nazis, officially the German-American Bund, held a pro-American rally in front of an enormous mural of George Washington before a raucous crowd of 22,000, as documented in the award-winning short documentary film, A Night at the Garden. Okay. Now, I believe this is going to take a second to load. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, American patriots, I'm sure I do not come before you tonight as a complete stranger. You all have heard of me through the Jewish controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail. We, with American ideals, demand that our government shall be returned to the American people who founded it.
We need to hear any more from Fritz Kuhn, the Bund's leader. Now, if you watch this film, which is only 7 minutes long and highly recommended, you're going to also see a young man named Isidore Greenbaum, there he is. He's rubbing the fist that he hit Kuhn with when he rushed the stage and managed to strike him before he was set upon by Kuhn's Nazi thugs and then New York's finest. 26-year-old plumber's helper from Brooklyn, who in interviews later on said, "What do you want me to do?" So I raised this disturbing history, right? The two kinds of the two big rallies at Madison Square Garden within 3 years of each other, because it still resonates today, obviously. And to argue that Nazi pageants are also a form of commemoration. Okay, getting back to 1942. Not everyone was satisfied with the nature of Jewish protest activity. Anybody know who this is? Peter Bergson. Anybody know who Peter Bergson is? Also known as Hillel Kook. Yes, that Kook family. He changed his name because his uncle was Harav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, Palestine, Israel. And he began working in 1938 for Jabotinsky's Etzel, the Irgun, in Poland, helping smuggle Jews to Palestine. And then he came with him in 1940 to the US to raise funds for a range of interrelated organizations that he founded. The Committee for a Jewish Army of Stateless Palestinian Jews, that's a mouthful. The American League for a Free Palestine, I just find that amusing today. The Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, and the Hebrew Committee for National Liberation. Through these organizations, Bergson, Cook, and his group first worked to support the Jewish underground in Palestine, then shifted audaciously, once World War II broke out, to establishing a Jewish army. And then, once the mass murder of Jews became clear, they shifted attention again to the project of rescuing European Jews and lobbying the government to intervene to end the Nazi murder of Jews. The Bergson Group's activities were beyond the pale in terms of the more typically conservative Jewish organized protests, like the group that mounted that protest in Madison Square Garden in 1942. They were bold, they were aggressive, and they were dramatic. Supported by the likes of Hollywood screenwriter Ben Hecht and artist Arthur Schick, they were single-minded in their efforts to get the public's attention. For example, from 1943 to 44, the group placed more than 200 ads in American newspapers with provocative headlines such as, "How well are you sleeping? Is there something you could have done to save millions of innocent people from torture and death?" I see a bit of an echo of this technique, just to flash forward, in a contemporary set of billboards created by the Jew Belong campaign. I don't know if anybody's been following this. It's fairly new and fresh, but they get people's attention. And here's one that was in Times Square. If you can't read it, it says, "Being woke and anti-Semitic is like being a vegan who eats veal."
By the way, I just, Rabbi Saul Schiff credits that 1942 Madison Square Garden rally. He went with his father later on to being an influence in his decision to go into rabbit and
Wow.
yes, in his memoir.
Wow. Okay. So now here's an example from February 16th, 1943, of one of the ads published by the Bergson Group in response to a news report in the Times 3 days earlier that Romania was proposing to the UN to transfer Jews out of Transnistria for a price. The group took out this shocking full-page ad in the New York Times, and I'm sure you can see the headline: "For sale to humanity, 70,000 Jews, guaranteed human beings at $50 a piece." There's a lot in this that really needs to be unpacked, but this was their mode of intervening, of getting people's attention. When the American Jewish Congress heard that the Bergson Group was planning a mass rally at the Garden, they quickly created their own event that was going to preempt it by about a week. That was on March 1st, 1943. A lot of co-sponsors. Again, it was called Stop Hitler Now. It reportedly drew 75,000 people. I'm not sure about the numbers because I don't know how many it held. But not to be outdone, the Bergson Group opened their pageant called "We Will Never Die" at the Garden on March 9th and 10th, with 2 performances before touring nationally and getting a lot of press along the way. It was an all-star production, written, of course, by Ben Hecht, scored by Kurt Weill, produced by Billy Rose, directed by Moss Hart, starring Paul Mooney and Edward G. Robinson. Some people might remember those names. I was looking at my wife. She's right behind you. Oh, am I red?
Okay.
Should be red. And let me show you a clip of this. This is the still. Let's see. Okay. You know what? I'm not going to be able to show you that clip. I'm going to skip that. If you go to the website of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and look up we will never die, you'll see. You'll see that. Oh, share screen. Yeah, I need to do that. The bar. Oh, there it is. I've only been teaching online for a year and a half. Thanks so much. Okay. I'm going to try not to do that too many more times. You don't need my video, do you? Do you want my video? Hold on. Okay. Okay. I won't do that again. My point was it seemed there was a lot of public attention being paid to the plight of the Jews of Europe. And I guess there's nothing like a little Jewish competition. While it's not clear whether these public performances had any immediate impact on behavior, they certainly raised awareness, and one might argue helped pave the way for eventual US government response to the Holocaust. Notably, 1 month later, the now famous uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto began, contributing a new scene to the still touring pageant and leading to more observances worldwide, Jewish and non-Jewish. Sadly, on May 12, 1943, upon hearing of the liquidation of the ghetto, Shmuel Zeigelbaum, whose June 1942 report presented some of the first news of the genocide against Jews in Europe, committed suicide. The news of the liquidation of the ghetto also led to more demonstrations and rallies worldwide, including commemorations in 1944 on the one-year anniversary at the start of the uprising, and calls for a monument, which was designed by Nathan Rappaport, built literally on the ruins of the ghetto and unveiled on the 5th anniversary of the uprising, as you can see here. And I mean, just look at the devastation in that area is really remarkable. Commemorative performances shifted dramatically after the end of the war and the realization of the extent of Nazi crimes towards mourning and survivor-driven activities. This is neither the time nor the place to go over an entire history of post-war memorialization efforts, but I will note that the earliest commemoration ceremonies in the DP camps set the form and tone for most of the many worldwide ceremonies to follow, with a mix of prayers, songs, and anthems, Kel Mele Rachamim, ghetto and partisan songs of resistance, national anthems, and Hatikva, which was not yet a national anthem. In Europe, many early memorials were soon built, which included certain common features, and many of the early Holocaust memorials, whether generally more figurative and socialist realist in Eastern Europe or more abstract and avant-garde in the West, these hewed closely to a static monumental design standard, relying on classical forms like obelisks and towers. And though they later grew a little bit more expansive and complex in the 1960s and on, by themselves, they're not very interesting. Leaving out the commemoration ceremonies that might use these monuments as sites for memorial observances on the specific anniversaries and other important dates, these memorials are not really my topic for tonight. So why did I bring all the early stuff up? I want to stress the urgency that came out of the commemorative efforts in the 1940s that called attention to the plight of European Jewry while they were still being murdered. An urgency that lent greater purpose to those efforts and created what I see as a kind of friction in their performances and representations. It made them into visceral enactments. It made them into invocations of some things very much at stake. For the remainder of my talk, I want to present just a few cases in order to briefly explore the nature and the implications of this symbolic friction for memorial activities in the present and what we might learn from them. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the way drama is implied. And I have two examples of memorials that wordlessly introduce this kind of symbolic friction, one in Budapest and one in Berlin. The former, titled Shoes on the Danube Bank or Promenade, features 60 iron pairs of men's, women's, and children's shoes fixed in the concrete with signs in Hungarian, English, and Hebrew, reading to the memory of victims shot into the Danube by Arrow Cross militiamen in 1944-45. It was created by a film director named Kan Toge and a sculptor, Gyula Power. And it was unveiled in 2005 on the Pest side of the river that divides Buda from Pest. The latter example from Berlin, titled The Abandoned or Deserted Room, Der Verlassene Raum, is a modest installation in the residential neighborhood of Koppenplatz in East Berlin's Mitte district, and includes, as an inscription running along the perimeter of the false parquet floor, a famous poem by Nelly Sachs, "Oh, the houses of death, invitingly appointed for the landlord of the house who was once a guest. Oh, you fingers laying the threshold like a knife between life and death. Oh, you chimney stacks, oh, you fingers, and the body of Israel going up in smoke." And you can see just a little bit of the inscription of the poem on the edge there. Designed by Karl Biedermann and Eva Butzmann for a Kristallnacht memorial competition that they won in 1989, it was finally built and unveiled after the fall of the wall in 1996. Both memorials are in urban public spaces and are highly legible, although some visitors do think in Berlin that this example is really a memorial to the poet Nelly Sachs. Both show us how a memorial can inscribe the memory of the past back into the landscape, even without a commemoration ceremony to formally enact that memory. And also both, needless to say, kind of preserve a moment in time, a moment of horror that is indicated really only by the absence of human beings. I also want to look briefly at the Stolpersteine project. This was begun in 1996 by artist Günter Demnig when he began traveling around Germany laying brass nameplate cobblestones, which are now each handmade by a sculptor, Michael Friedrichs Friedlander. He makes about 450 of them a month. These sit ever so slightly above the sidewalk surface, and the intent of the project is to remind people that the victims of Nazism lived in their communities and need to be commemorated. As to the name, Demnig tends to cite a school child when asked about this, who once answered a journalist's inquiry as to whether people could actually stumble on one of these Stolperstein and trip. He answered by saying, "You don't trip on a Stolperstein, you stumble with your head and your heart." The 75,000th Stolperstein was installed in December 2019. They can be found in 2,000 villages, towns, and cities throughout Europe. And Demnig, this is the artist, he always places the first stone in any town or city. According to his vision, each stone is meant to commemorate one victim of Nazism, whether murdered or not. So, for example, it's possible for stones to be placed together to memorialize victims and surviving family members, right? You can have like a stone that memorializes somebody who was murdered in a camp and also somebody who survived because they're connected. Thereby returning individuality to those the Nazis wanted to group together. Each of these is installed with the support of relatives. It's very important to the organization that relatives are involved. In front of that person's last residence of choice, which I find so fascinating, right? It's not the places to which victims were forced to move, such as the Judenhauser, the Jew houses that were among the 42,500 sites of incarceration, of Jewish incarceration all throughout Europe. The precise location of the stone is typically decided by Demnig on site on the day of the installation, which I imagine makes people a little nervous. But he comes and he decides kind of exactly where in front of the house and the sidewalk it's going to be placed. And then he starts digging. And interestingly, the team does not itself organize any ceremonies to accompany the installation, which only takes about 20 minutes with the help of local laborers. He does, by the way, he does about 6 a day. The stones typically begin with the heading, "Hier lived," "Hier wohnt." There are also about 25 Stolperschwellen. These are called, loosely translated, stumbling thresholds, which are installed at select locations where there were many victims in one location. This is a memorial to victims of the Nazi T4 so-called euthanasia program. The Stolpersteine are interesting because they're designed to interrupt present-day lives, to force passersby to pause if they notice them and consider them in their context, to read them, to try to figure out the relationship of the stone to the place, and thereby creating minor memorial performances and dramas of realization. And also, you know, this is today. I found this online today. This is November 9th, 2021 in Leipzig. The stones had been there already, but this is a group that every year comes out on Kristallnacht to clean them, which I find very moving. So this project is highly attuned to the issue of local remembrance and invites reflection and conversation about local historical awareness and responsibility, potentially connecting visitors to the real consequences of Nazi policies. How are we doing? Okay. So since the hour is late, and I knew it was going to get this way, I'm just going to mention one more issue, and that is of photographic self-representation, which is a fancy way for saying selfies. Obviously, this is more recent. I mean, I have photos of myself at places and that I'm not quite sure how I took them, but it's a lot easier these days. They result from a combination of factors, including a very typical tourist desire to document oneself at memorable sites and attractions, put together with the technological means enabling anyone to take a self-portrait with their cell phone. Now, social media is a crucial method for Holocaust museums and memorials worldwide to connect with their audiences, particularly younger ones. Indeed, the Auschwitz Museum has its own social media accounts where it even posts visitor-created photos. So we can't fairly condemn all self-photography at serious sites, since as the Auschwitz Museum's kind of media contact and all-around good guy and person who does everything, I'll tell you a story about him later, Pavel Sawicki, as he pointed out, sometimes visitors indicate with captions in their own demeanor that they're aware of the gravity of the memorial and they wish to simply add their own commemoration to it. So it's not fair to condemn all selfies, but there are cases that cross a line. Enough that in 2019, Sawicki had to post through the Auschwitz Museum a request via Twitter, no less. When you come to the Auschwitz Museum, remember you're at the site where over 1 million people were killed, respect their memory. There are better places to learn how to walk in a balance beam than the site which symbolizes deportation of hundreds of thousands to their deaths. Some have been less polite in their responses to selfies of questionable propriety. In 2017, Shahak Shapira created a website he titled Holocaust, in which he publicly shamed 12 tourists who had posted selfies to their social media accounts taken at the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. That is, do you mind hitting the light for 1 second? You have to see this. Okay, I think I can go on in the dark for just a minute. This is Berlin's difficult abstract Holocaust monument designed by Peter Eisenman and opened in 2005, consisting of 2,710 concrete stelae of various heights arranged in a grid in this undulating field that's just south of the Brandenburg Gate and the American Embassy. I'll turn the light back on in 1 minute. Shapira had taken these selfies and superimposed them onto historical atrocity photos, which is a very controversial and problematic thing. And out of sensitivity, I can't really even show them to you. There's one that is, you know, not using corpses essentially. This is just another view of the memorial. But so this is what he did with that selfie. Interestingly enough, this is the photo with Elie Wiesel in it from the liberation of Buchenwald. Okay, if you could hit the lights, please. But Shapira also posted a potential remedy for the shamed visitors. They could write him and ask to be removed from his site. All 12 did so immediately. Within a week, the site was gone. You need to go to the Internet Archive, actually, to kind of figure out what was happening. All apologized for their callous behavior. Some of them really wrote some very, very moving comments about kind of what they learned through the process about, you know, being young and stupid. And all removed the selfies from their own social media accounts, and therefore Shapira removed the photos from his. These tourists in Berlin and Auschwitz are putting themselves literally in the picture. The difference, I think, might come from the distinction between an actual site of genocidal murder like Auschwitz, which hopefully inspires some selfie restraint, versus an abstract memorial at a site like the Berlin site, go back to show it to you, not directly associated with mass murder. I mean, a lot of people have complained about this memorial. What does it mean? What are people supposed to do here? You know, people end up doing what people do, right? Now, I can't say fairly that it's completely unrelated to the Shoah because it's built on the former premises of the Gestapo headquarters. But it's certainly true that quite a few tourists, I think, not arguably any of those shamed by Shapira, quite a few tourists might not fully appreciate the intended meanings of a site like this abstract memorial. And this teaches us finally something about Holocaust memorials in the 21st century and the importance of the in commemoration. What these individual memorial performances do is bring the contemporary individual in close contact with the events and the people being commemorated, to which they otherwise might have very little relationship. While I personally find selfie behavior problematic, I appreciate what it can achieve. A heightened personal connection to the Shoah through an individual act of remembrance. I think 21st century Holocaust commemoration could use many more of these individual enactments, supported by memorial environments that are legible and convey some aspect of the real dramas that they're built to commemorate. Because otherwise, the generations born long after will eventually find no access points at all to a past they find increasingly distant. And certainly, those who hate us, like the Unite the Right marchers in Charlottesville, are finding ways to connect to the past themselves. And they're putting themselves in the picture, so to speak. They participate in their own memorial enactments, their own performances of, in this case, Nazi ideology. We need to learn how to respond. Allow me to conclude, therefore, with something I read just this past weekend, an excerpt from Touched by His Blessing by Rabbi Yechiel Spiro, a sefer about Birkat HaMazon published at the Art Scroll Shabbos table. And I quote, Rav Yoshua Moshe Aronson brings a novel explanation to the pasuk, Potech et yadecha umasbia l'kol chai ratzon, which struck him during the days of destruction that he experienced. You open your hand and satiate all. Oh, what happened? Okay. Satiate all with a chai ratzon, a desire to live. This ratzon has enabled the Jewish people to withstand the persecution of numerous evil and brutal nations who acted as if their sole reason for existence was to wipe the Jewish people off the face of the earth, devoting irrational efforts and means to accomplish this goal. But they failed, every one of them. So while we thank the Almighty for his provisions, we must also express gratitude for the inexplicable chai ratzon we possess. What a gift it is. One more example of this chai ratzon. And I'm going to want to share again. I'm actually going to need to get out of this. This is the occasion of a Haknasat Sefer Torah in Vienna. You see here, 94-year-old survivor, Harav Yisachar Dov Ber Keren, who paused during the procession at a spot where 83 years earlier, a gang of Nazi youths had almost beaten him to death. And he paused to recite the bracha, Baruch she'asali nes, with one hand on the new Sefer Torah. I have a recording, but it's going to be too hard to switch back and forth. Maybe I'll try to do it during the Q&A. There is a plaque at the site as well, but I don't know if anybody was reading it that day. Thank you very much. Okay. Let's see if I can. Are there any, oh, here we go. Are there any questions? Let me try to bring up this video. It's, okay, there it is. Okay. Questions, comments?
So actually that last video sparked in me. I'm a news junkie, especially news related to the Jewish community and Jewish people. When I think about things that have sparked my thoughts about Holocaust commemoration, it's often stories related to sites that were play an integral, poignant role in that period of time, but with a new spin. So I remember a couple of years ago, and I just looked it up while you were playing that video, how Zaka went to the Danube River to try to find, to try to check the river for remains. And it ended up that they didn't find any, but that story sort of brings it back to that moment.
Yeah.
I haven't been there, so I haven't seen shoes, although I've seen them in pictures. But the fact that it's living in that way, and there was just a story last week ago, probably heard about the priest from Jaffa.
Yes.
That they had a he wanted to be buried with his family that were killed at a mass grave.
Yeah.
And they had boys there singing Mamin and Hatikva. So it's those things that, very much bring to me some of what you've been talking about, how it's a different set of circumstances, but it's oftentimes the same place, and how it's meant to bring us back to commemorate and remember those original events.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that story about the priest, it's just remarkable because it doesn't make sense. And yet it's so, but it does. He lived his entire life as a priest, but he wanted to be buried as a Jew. And for him, that was just his life. That expressed his dual identity, as it were. We're working on a project. Some colleagues and I, we're holding a workshop next summer, God willing, at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, dealing with what we're calling sacred objects related to the Holocaust. And in speaking to the curators there, one of the discussions that's come up is, what do they do with, for example, one object that was donated to the museum was from a survivor who survived in a convent, and she converted, and the artifact that represented that entire time period for her was rosary beads, and she donated that to the museum. And for her, this encapsulates her story, her survival, her experience, and this object is related to how she lived, and it's very, very, very important to her that be cherished. And so hopefully we'll get the opportunity to work with some other folks on some other kinds of objects, and see also some of the things that come out of the collection that are rare and odd and strange, and just express these very, very complicated identity stories. Lisa.
I was so moved by this presentation, and I learned a ton, so thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Not a very deep question, just curious. Why did that journalist commit suicide? Any idea?
I mean, he wasn't a journalist, he was,
The person that wrote
yeah, he was, I think there were several Poles who were involved in the government in exile, who really had a very hard time with international reactions or lack thereof. And he felt that he was working for a year and a half, I think, to try to get the world to pay attention to what was going on. And we wasn't getting any traction. And then when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising happened, I think for him, he was from Warsaw, it gave him so much hope. And then when the ghetto was liquidated, I think he didn't know what else to do. I mean, I don't know how to understand something. It was, very sadly, it was a very gruesome thing. He did it ultimately as a protest. I mean, he thought, if no one's going to listen to me in my life, then maybe they're going to listen to me in my death. Yeah. It's a very sad story.
The American movement, their rally was in 1939.
Yeah.
Was there no Jewish reaction at that point?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Because the main
there were Jews outside protesting while it was going on.
But it didn't seem like there was a lot of protest and reaction. What type of protest was there when 22,000 pro-Nazis get together in Madison Square Garden? So
there were, protests outside. I think it was, several thousand people. It was, there were editorials. There's freedom of speech in this country,
No, but it seems to me like, unfortunately, the American Jewish community waited until America was in the war. Because the major rally that you discussed was in 1942, after America already entered the war. Before that, maybe they were afraid.
They were afraid, maybe. America was very isolationist.
Right.
There was a sense in the Jewish community that they shouldn't get involved in politics, that it wouldn't bode well, that it's not appropriate. That's why much of the organized community was so upset with the Bergson group, because the Bergson group said, throw propriety to the wind, people are being murdered. And they did whatever they could. There was stuff I cut out. I mean, they organized this famous rabbis' march on the Capitol in March of 1943, and that had a big impact, right? So I think the organized look. Stephen Wise really was the leader of the non-Orthodox American Jewry. And he advised caution, right? He advised that Jews be careful. Remember, America was an anti-Semitic country, right? I mean, it was I think there was definitely a sense in some quarters of the Jewish community that you have to be careful because, I mean, this is the era of Lindbergh and Father Charles Coughlin. The anti-Semitism was acceptable.
It's interesting because Rafi Medoff does not let Stephen Wise off the hook.
He doesn't let anybody off the hook.
Doesn't let anyone off the hook, certainly not FDR. So just, to the past, is that
Yeah.
the reality on the ground?
Yeah, Madoff gets criticism from a lot of the scholarly community because of exactly that, for assuming that people act in a vacuum, right? And that people will always do whatever is the most right thing. So, Michael Berenbaum came a few years ago and he gave a talk that his title is something like, FDR was the best president at the time doing whatever it was that he could possibly do, and that's no compliment. Something like that. And he compares him to Noah, right? I heard him give a talk. It was the week after Parshat Noach, and the first question was, wasn't this in the Parsha? And he's a conservative rabbi, so he can do that thing, seamlessly. So he immediately jumped into a whole drasha about it. It was it was very good.
By the way, you mentioned sacred objects. Fascinating. Looking forward to hearing more about that. I just got an email today from the RCA, Rabbinical Council of America, that their winter 2022 journal will have an article or a small snippet by Rabbi J.J. Schachter about, quote, a remarkable family heirloom, probably from his father, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who Rafi Medoff just wrote a book with it.
Yes. Yeah.
So after I read it out.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, Matt.
What year was the ship?
The St. Louis?
Yeah, the St. Louis. What year was that turned around? Wasn't that
It was May 1938.
Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the St. Louis is that it really gets undue attention because there are many ships coming over without much trouble. A colleague of mine was writing a paper on a ship called the Kwanzaa that docked in Newport, Virginia. There's a recent documentary made about it, and it was completely the opposite of the story of the St. Louis. The local community banded together and brought food and made sure that the ship, once here, would stay and would not leave until its passengers disembarked and were somehow, taken care of. So the St. Louis is, it's a terrible story, and it points to these very restrictive American immigration policies at the time. But it's not the case that every ship was like that. Thank you very much, as always, and